On a quiet street in Los Angeles' Holmby Hills neighborhood, hidden behind high walls and mature landscaping, sits a property that most Disney fans don't know exists. 355 North Carolwood Drive was Walt Disney's private estate from 1950 until his death in 1966. It's where he built a 1/8 scale railroad that circled his property, the Carolwood Pacific Railroad, complete with tunnels, trestles, and a 250-foot-long track. That backyard railroad wasn't a hobby. It was an escape. Walt Disney built it because he was trapped in an empire of his own creation, weighed down by expectations he couldn't meet, pursued by demons he couldn't outrun, and isolated by perfectionism that made genuine human connection nearly impossible. This is the story of a man who created the happiest place on earth while being unable to find happiness himself. A man who built an empire on childhood wonder while remaining emotionally stunted. A man who preached family values in his films while being a distant, often absent father. A man who died at 65, worked to death by his own relentless drive, killed by cigarettes he chain-smoked to cope with stress he created for himself. Walt Disney gave joy to millions, but he never found it for himself. And his Carolwood estate, the mansion he built for escape, became another beautiful prison. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. Walter Elias Disney was born in 1901 in Chicago to Elias and Flora Disney. His childhood was marked by his father's failures and temper. Elias Disney was a harsh disciplinarian who beat his sons and moved the family constantly as various business ventures failed. Young Walt learned early that the world was unstable, that father figures were dangerous, and that escape into imagination was safer than dealing with reality. The family moved to a farm in Missouri when Walt was 4. He later romanticized this period as idyllic rural Americana, but the reality was grueling farm labor and an abusive father. When Walt was 9, Elias gave up farming and moved the family to Kansas City. Walt delivered newspapers for his father's distribution route, getting up at 3:30 a.m., 7 days a week, in all weather. This childhood of instability, abuse, and labor shaped everything that followed. Walt learned to present a cheerful facade while hiding his real feelings. He learned that hard work was the only security. He learned not to trust others or get too close. And he learned to retreat into fantasy worlds where he had control. At 16, Walt dropped out of high school to join the Red Cross Ambulance Corps during World War I, lying about his age. The war ended before he saw combat, and he returned to Kansas City with no education, no prospects, and a burning need to be something more than his father, to succeed where Elias had failed, to build something permanent, to have control. He started as a commercial artist, then began making crude animated advertisements. In 1923, at age 21, Walt and his brother Roy moved to Los Angeles and started Disney Brothers Studio. For the next decade, they struggled, making cartoons, losing characters to unscrupulous distributors, nearly going bankrupt multiple times. The trauma of these early failures never left Walt. Even after becoming successful, he operated from a place of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being cheated, fear of failure. He became obsessively controlling because control was the only way to feel safe. And that need for control would poison his relationships, his health, and ultimately his ability to enjoy the success he fought so hard to achieve. Disney Brothers Studios' first major success was Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, but Walt lost the rights to the character through a distributor's contract manipulation in 1928. The betrayal was devastating. Walt had built something, invested everything in it, and someone took it from him. He would never allow himself to be that vulnerable again. His response was to create Mickey Mouse, a character he would own completely. Mickey became successful beyond anyone's imagination, and by the mid-1930s, Disney was producing the most popular cartoons in America. But success brought new pressures. Walt wasn't satisfied with short cartoons. He wanted to make feature-length animated films, something that had never been successfully done. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1937, was a massive gamble. Walt borrowed heavily, mortgaged everything, and drove his animators mercilessly to achieve perfection. The film cost $1.5 million, astronomical for a cartoon, and the industry called it Disney's folly, certain it would bankrupt him. Instead, Snow White became the highest-grossing film of 1938, earning over $8 million. Walt Disney was suddenly wealthy, respected, and at the forefront of animation. He had proven everyone wrong, but he had also established a pattern of relentless perfectionism, enormous financial risk, and treating employees as tools to achieve his vision rather than as human beings with their own needs. This pattern would define the rest of his life and create the environment that would ultimately destroy him. As the studio grew through the late 1930s and early 1940s, Walt became increasingly dictatorial. He paid his animators poorly while demanding extraordinary work. He took personal credit for work that was collaborative. He made decisions by instinct and refused to explain or justify them. The studio was his kingdom, and everyone in it existed to serve his vision. This came to a head in 1941 with the Disney animators' strike. Art Babbitt, one of Disney's best animators, led an effort to unionize and demand better pay and working conditions. Walt took it as a personal betrayal. He couldn't understand why his employees weren't grateful for the opportunity to work for him. He had built this studio, had taken all the financial risks, had created the environment where their talents could flourish. How dare they demand more? The strike lasted 5 weeks and was bitter and personal. Walt stood at the studio gates and personally confronted strikers, screaming at people he'd worked with for years. He saw the strike as proof that people were fundamentally disloyal and ungrateful. The fact that his animators were underpaid, overworked, and underappreciated while he took all the credit never seemed to occur to him. The strike was eventually settled with the animators getting better wages and union recognition. But Walt never forgave those who had struck. He quietly fired or sidelined many of them. He became even more controlling and suspicious. And he started cooperating with the FBI as an informant, providing information on suspected communists in Hollywood. Walt Disney's FBI file, released decades after his death, shows he was a special agent in charge contact and regularly reported on his employees and others in the entertainment industry. During the 1950s Red Scare, Walt's information likely contributed to people being blacklisted and losing their livelihoods. He saw himself as patriotically fighting communism. Others saw him as a vindictive man, using political hysteria to punish people he didn't like. This is the context in which Walt built his Carolwood estate. By 1950, he was wealthy, powerful, and deeply unhappy. The strike had shown him that success didn't buy loyalty. His marriage to Lillian was stable but distant. His 2 daughters, Diane and Sharon, adopted, barely knew him. He was always working, always at the studio, always chasing the next project. He needed an escape, so he built one. The house at 355 North Carolwood Drive was purchased in 1949 and designed by architect Walt Beckett. It was a sprawling single-story ranch-style mansion, over 5,000 square feet on a 1.4-acre lot. It had 5 bedrooms, a projection room where Walt could watch films, and a studio where he could work from home. It was beautiful, private, and entirely Walt's domain. But the real feature was the backyard railroad. Walt had been fascinated by trains since childhood. They represented adventure, escape, going somewhere better than where you were. In 1947, he had started building elaborate model trains. By 1950, he wanted something bigger, a real, working miniature railroad he could ride. The Carolwood Pacific Railroad was 1/8 scale, meaning everything was 1/8 the size of a real railroad. The locomotive was steam-powered and required an engineer's license to operate. Walt studied and got his license. The track ran in a loop around the property, through a tunnel under Lillian's flower garden, over a trestle, past a miniature town Walt had built. Walt spent hours on that railroad. He would come home from the studio and immediately disappear into the backyard to work on the train. He would ride the railroad alone, making laps around his property, smoking cigarettes, not talking to anyone. It was the only time he seemed relaxed, the only place where he had complete control without demands or expectations. His daughters later described their father as more interested in the train than in them. Walt would invite neighborhood children over to ride the train, but his own daughters had to watch as he played with other kids. It was easier for Walt to perform the role of the magical uncle for strangers than to be an actual father to his own children. Lillian hated the railroad. She thought it was childish and took time away from the family. But Walt needed it. The studio was overwhelming. Hundreds of employees, constant deadlines, enormous financial pressures. His marriage was distant but stable, which meant no real intimacy, but also no real conflict. The railroad was the one place where nothing was expected of him except to be himself. Except Walt didn't know who he was without work and control. So even the railroad became about perfection. Everything had to be exactly right. Every detail had to match his vision. The escape became another source of pressure. But Walt's real escape, his true Carolwood Pacific Railroad, would be Disneyland. The theme park he opened in 1955 was, in many ways, a massive version of his backyard railroad. A controlled environment where every detail matched his vision, where people could escape reality, where Walt could be in charge of everything. Planning and building Disneyland nearly destroyed Walt. He mortgaged his house, the Carolwood estate, borrowed against his life insurance, and created a separate company, WD Enterprises, to develop the park because Roy and the Disney board thought it was too risky. Walt once again bet everything on a vision everyone else thought was foolish. The opening day of Disneyland, July 17, 1955, was a disaster. Counterfeit tickets led to overcrowding. The asphalt was so fresh that women's high heels sank into it. Rides broke down. Restaurants ran out of food. It was broadcast live on television, and the whole country watched it fail. Walt was devastated. He had created this perfect place, this escape from reality, and reality had intruded anyway. But he did what he always did. He worked harder. He spent nearly every day at Disneyland for the next year, obsessively fixing problems, adjusting rides, perfecting details. Gradually, the park became what he had envisioned. A place where everything was controlled, where reality's rough edges were smoothed away, where people could be happy. Except Walt couldn't be happy there. He would walk the park in disguise, watching people enjoy themselves, unable to join them. He saw the flaws no one else noticed. He was already planning improvements, expansions, corrections. Disneyland was supposed to be his escape, but like everything else in his life, it became another thing he had to perfect, another thing he couldn't enjoy. Back at Carolwood, the railroad sat mostly unused. Walt was too busy with Disneyland, then with expanding the studio, then with plans for Walt Disney World in Florida. The backyard escape had been replaced by a 160-acre escape, but the pattern remained the same. Build something perfect, find it inadequate, build something bigger. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. Walt's relationship with his daughters during this period was distant at best. Diane, the older daughter, later wrote that her father was like having a stranger who occasionally visited. Sharon, who was adopted, struggled with feeling like she didn't really belong. Both daughters craved their father's attention and rarely got it. Walt's idea of fatherhood was providing material comfort and occasional grand gestures, trips to Disneyland, expensive gifts, a big house. But he didn't know how to have actual conversations with his daughters, how to be emotionally present, how to just spend time with them without it being a performance or obligation. Part of this was generational. Emotional distance from fathers was common in that era. But part of it was Walt's own damage. His father had been abusive and distant. Walt had learned early that showing emotion was dangerous, that vulnerability led to pain. So he built walls, kept everyone at a distance, and poured himself into work where the rules were clear and success was measurable. Lillian, meanwhile, lived in the Carolwood mansion with a husband who was barely there. Walt would come home late, eat dinner in silence, watch films in his projection room, or disappear to work on the train. They had separate bedrooms. They had little to talk about. Walt's life was the studio, and Lillian had stopped trying to be part of that world years ago. It was a marriage of convenience and habit more than love. Lillian was loyal, supportive, and never publicly criticized Walt. But those close to the family said there was little warmth between them, little joy. They were partners in maintaining an image, not in building a life together. The Carolwood estate, beautiful and spacious, was home to a family that barely functioned as one. Walt was usually at the studio or at Disneyland. The daughters were at school or with friends. Lillian managed the household and appeared at social functions. They all lived in the same house, but led separate lives. There was one tragedy that haunted Walt for the rest of his life, though he rarely spoke about it. In 1938, flush with snow-white success, Walt bought his parents a house in Los Angeles so they could be near him. Shortly after his parents moved in, his mother Flora died of asphyxiation from a faulty furnace. Walt had bought the house, had arranged the repairs, and his mother had died there. He blamed himself, though whether the furnace was truly faulty or she had accidentally left gas on was never definitively determined. But Walt carried that guilt for the rest of his life. His response was characteristic. He never talked about it, never processed the grief, never sought help or comfort. He just worked harder, smoked more, and built higher walls around his emotions. The mother he had loved, the one source of warmth in his harsh childhood, was gone, and it was somehow his fault. This tragedy added another layer to Walt's already complicated psychology. He had built success to prove himself to his father. He had created fantasy worlds to escape reality. And now he carried the belief that his success had killed his mother. No amount of achievement could undo that. No perfect park or beloved character could bring her back. The Carolwood estate, purchased over a decade later, was another manifestation of this guilt. Walt kept buying houses, building spaces, creating environments, as if the perfect place could undo the tragedy of the imperfect one where his mother died. But no house could do that. No backyard railroad could provide that escape. By the late 1950s, Walt Disney was one of the most famous men in America. His films were beloved. Disneyland was a cultural phenomenon. The Mickey Mouse Club television show brought Disney into millions of homes weekly. He was Uncle Walt, America's storyteller, the man who made dreams come true. But the private Walt Disney was exhausted, isolated, and deeply unhappy. He chain-smoked, multiple packs a day, constantly. He had a chronic cough that he ignored. He worked relentlessly. 16-hour days were standard. He slept poorly and ate irregularly. His health was deteriorating, but he refused to slow down. Those who worked closely with him described a man who was brilliant but difficult, generous but controlling, charming but distant. He could be warm and encouraging one moment, then cold and cutting the next. He remembered every slight and rewarded every loyalty. He demanded absolute devotion from employees while maintaining emotional distance. Walt trusted almost no one. His brother Roy handled finances, but Walt resented him for being practical when Walt wanted to dream. His core team of artists and Imagineers were talented, but Walt saw them as tools to execute his vision, not as creative partners. He had no real friends. Everyone in his life was either family, employees, or business associates. The Carolwood estate reflected this isolation. It was designed for privacy, hidden behind walls and landscaping. Walt could come home and be completely alone, seen by no one, accountable to no one. But that isolation, which he craved, also reinforced his loneliness. He would ride his backyard railroad alone, smoking cigarettes, lost in thoughts he never shared. Was he planning his next project? Replaying old failures? Thinking about his mother? We don't know. Walt never told anyone what he thought about during those solitary railroad rides, and now we never will. In 1964, Walt and Roy began seriously planning Walt Disney World in Florida. It would be bigger than Disneyland, more ambitious, an entire city controlled by Disney, with experimental communities, resorts, and a theme park that would make Disneyland look small. It was Walt's most grandiose vision yet, the ultimate expression of his need to create perfect, controlled environments. But Walt's health was failing rapidly. The chronic cough had worsened. He was losing weight. He looked gaunt and exhausted. But he refused to see doctors or admit something was wrong. He had parks to build, films to produce, a legacy to secure. He couldn't be sick. He didn't have time for sickness. By late 1966, the symptoms couldn't be ignored anymore. Walt finally saw doctors who found a spot on his left lung. It was cancer, aggressive, advanced, already spreading. The decades of chain smoking had finally caught up with him. He was 64 years old. The diagnosis was devastating, but not surprising to those who had watched Walt destroy his health for decades. He had worked himself relentlessly, smoked constantly, ignored every warning sign. He had built an empire, but at the cost of his own body. Walt underwent surgery in November 1966 to remove the tumor in part of his lung. But it was too late. The cancer had spread. He was given months at most. And even then, from his hospital bed, Walt was working. He had ceiling tiles installed showing the Florida property plans, and he would lie there pointing at the ceiling, explaining his vision for Walt Disney World to anyone who would listen. He died on December 15, 1966, at St. Joseph's Hospital in Burbank, California. He was 65 years old. The official cause of death was acute circulatory collapse. His heart gave out as his body failed. But really, Walt Disney died from decades of stress, perfectionism, workaholism, and cigarettes. He worked himself to death, literally. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. After Walt's death, Lillian stayed at the Carolwood estate for several years before selling it. She couldn't bear to be there anymore. The house was filled with reminders of a husband who had been physically present but emotionally absent, who had built a backyard railroad, but not a relationship with his family. The backyard railroad was partially dismantled. Some pieces went to Disneyland for display. Others were sold or stored. The property changed hands multiple times over the decades. The house was remodeled, updated, modernized. The current owners have maintained some Disney touches, but it's a private residence, not a museum. What remains of the Carolwood Pacific Railroad is minimal. The track layout is gone. The tunnel is filled in. The trestle is removed. A small shed, the original Carolwood barn, where Walt kept his railroad equipment, was moved to the Los Angeles Live Steamers Railroad Museum in Griffith Park, where it's preserved as a shrine to Walt's hobby. But the barn is just a building. The railroad is gone. And what they represented, Walt's need for escape, his inability to find peace, his substitution of a perfect miniature world for the messy reality of family and relationships, that's lost to history, known only to those who saw Walt ride alone around his backyard, smoking and silent. Walt Disney's legacy is complicated. On one hand, he created joy for hundreds of millions of people. His films, his parks, his characters have brought genuine happiness to multiple generations. Mickey Mouse, Disneyland, the animated classics, these are meaningful contributions to human culture. On the other hand, Walt was a difficult man who sacrificed his health, his relationships, and his own happiness in pursuit of perfection. He underpaid workers while demanding total devotion. He cooperated with the FBI to blacklist people whose politics he disagreed with. He was a distant father and an absent husband. He built an empire but destroyed himself in the process. The Carolwood estate encapsulates this duality. It was a beautiful home where an unhappy family lived. It had a magical backyard railroad that a lonely man rode alone. It was supposed to be a refuge, but became another place where Walt couldn't find peace. Those who want to defend Walt point to his artistry, his innovation, his vision. Those who want to condemn him point to his treatment of workers, his political activities, his emotional coldness. Both perspectives have merit. Walt Disney was neither a saint nor a monster. He was a deeply damaged man who did extraordinary things while being unable to enjoy them. The tragedy of Walt Disney isn't that he failed. It's that he succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination and still couldn't be happy. He achieved everything he worked for: wealth, fame, respect, creative freedom, the ability to build anything he could imagine, and none of it filled the void inside him. He built Disneyland as an escape from reality, but he couldn't enjoy it. He built the Carolwood Pacific Railroad as personal refuge, but he rode it alone, still stressed, still smoking, still driven by demons he couldn't outrun. He created the happiest place on earth, but couldn't find happiness there himself. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Walt's life. Success doesn't heal childhood trauma. Achievement doesn't replace emotional connection. Perfection doesn't equal peace. You can build empires and still be miserable if you're running from yourself rather than towards something meaningful. Walt spent his entire life trying to control everything: his animations, his parks, his employees, his image. But he couldn't control his own emotions, couldn't heal his own wounds, couldn't let down the walls he'd built as a child. So he died at 65, worked to death, having given joy to millions but found none for himself. There's a photograph of Walt at Disneyland in the early 1960s. He's standing alone in front of Sleeping Beauty Castle at dawn, before the park opens. He's smoking a cigarette, hands in his pockets, looking at the castle with an expression that's hard to read. Is it pride? Satisfaction? Or is it the realization that even this, his perfect place, isn't enough? We'll never know. Walt never opened up about his inner life, never processed his trauma in any public way, never admitted that despite all his success, he was profoundly unhappy. He maintained the Uncle Walt persona until the end, cheerful, optimistic, always moving forward. But those who knew him saw the reality. Roy Disney, in private moments after Walt's death, admitted his brother had been difficult, driven, and unable to enjoy life. Diane Disney acknowledged her father had been distant and consumed by work. Even Lillian, loyal to the end, admitted that Walt had been more married to his work than to her. The Carolwood estate, with its backyard railroad, was supposed to be Walt's escape from all that pressure. But escape requires letting go, and Walt never could. So the railroad became another project to perfect, another thing to control, another place where he was alone with his thoughts and his cigarettes and his inability to rest. Today, the Disney Corporation is one of the largest media conglomerates on Earth. It owns theme parks worldwide, film studios, television networks, streaming services, and countless franchises. It generates over $80 billion in annual revenue. The Walt Disney Company has far exceeded anything Walt himself imagined. But the company's success raises an uncomfortable question. Would Walt be happy with what Disney has become? The corporation is driven by profit margins, merchandising opportunities, and franchise management. Creativity is often secondary to financial considerations. The magic that Walt obsessed over is frequently sacrificed for efficiency and market testing. In some ways, modern Disney is the opposite of what Walt wanted. It's a massive bureaucracy where no single person has total creative control, where decisions are made by committees and market research rather than instinct and vision. Walt would have hated it. But in other ways, modern Disney is exactly what Walt created. An empire built on controlling every detail of the customer experience, on creating perfect fantasy worlds that people pay to escape into, on selling happiness while the mechanics behind it remain hidden. The corporate Disney is Walt's perfectionism and control amplified to a global scale. The Carolwood estate, small and intimate compared to the global Disney Corporation, represents what was lost in that expansion. It was the last place where Walt had direct, personal control, where he could build something with his own hands, where the empire was small enough that one person could see all of it at once. As Disney grew beyond Walt's direct control, he lost that intimacy. The corporation became too big for any one person to manage perfectly. And for someone like Walt, whose identity was built on total control, that loss was devastating. He died planning Walt Disney World, but knowing he wouldn't live to see it completed, wouldn't be able to perfect it, wouldn't have control over how it evolved. The dismantling of the Carolwood Pacific Railroad after Walt's death is symbolic. It represented Walt's need for a miniature world he could control, and when he died, there was no one else who wanted or needed it in the same way. Lillian saw it as a monument to her husband's absence. The daughters saw it as a reminder of the father who had preferred it to spending time with them. So it was taken apart, piece by piece, and scattered. Some parts were preserved, most were lost. The place where Walt had spent countless hours riding alone, trying to find peace, was erased. The house was remodeled, the yard was redesigned, and the physical evidence of Walt's private escape disappeared. This is perhaps appropriate. Walt had spent his life creating public personas and hiding his private self. In death, even his private refuges were dismantled and hidden away. What remains is the public image. Uncle Walt, the dreamer, the man who made magic real. The troubled, lonely, driven man who rode a backyard railroad alone is mostly forgotten. But that man was real. He was perhaps more real than the public Walt Disney, the carefully constructed image that Walt presented to the world. And understanding him, his pain, his drive, his inability to find peace despite extraordinary success, is essential to understanding his legacy. The last tragic element of Walt's story is that he died without fully appreciating what he had accomplished. He was already planning the next thing, always focused on what was coming rather than what was. Disneyland was a success, but Walt was thinking about Disney World. His films were beloved, but he was worried about the next one. His characters were iconic, but he was creating new ones. This inability to be present, to appreciate the moment, to feel satisfied with achievement, it's the core tragedy of Walt Disney's life. He spent his entire life chasing something he could never catch, because he was chasing external validation for internal wounds. No amount of success could heal the abused child who had grown up in chaos and instability. No perfect theme park could undo the death of his mother. No backyard railroad could fill the void left by emotional disconnection. Walt Disney gave the world magic, wonder, and joy, but he couldn't give those things to himself. He died having created the happiest place on earth without ever finding happiness himself. He built fantasy worlds because reality was too painful. And in the end, reality caught up with him anyway. In the form of cancer caused by the cigarettes he chain-smoked to cope with stress he created for himself. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. If you visit Disneyland today, you can see Walt's apartment above the fire station on Main Street. It's been preserved exactly as it was when he died. Small, modest, filled with personal touches. A lamp in the window stays lit as a tribute, signifying Walt is still there. But Walt isn't there. He was barely there when he was alive. The apartment was more symbol than home, more image than reality. Walt spent most of his time working, not relaxing in his apartment. Even at Disneyland, his supposed refuge, he couldn't rest. The real Walt Disney died alone in a hospital bed, his body consumed by cancer, his life consumed by work. The Carolwood estate, where he had tried to build a personal escape, was empty. The backyard railroad sat unused. The family he had neglected would eventually scatter his ashes and move on. What remains is the public legacy, the films, the parks, the company. And that legacy is extraordinary. But it came at a cost that's rarely discussed. Walt Disney destroyed himself to create it. He sacrificed his health, his relationships, his peace, and ultimately his life in pursuit of perfection he could never achieve. The Carolwood Pacific Railroad, that 1/8 scale train that circled his backyard, is the perfect metaphor for Walt's life. A beautiful creation that went nowhere, ridden by a man trying to escape who could never escape himself, ultimately dismantled and forgotten while the empire he built grew beyond anything he could control. That's the tragic story. Not failure, but success at too high a cost. Not a villain, but a damaged man who created beauty while being unable to experience it. Not a cautionary tale about ambition, but a reminder that external achievement can't heal internal wounds. Walt Disney built magical kingdoms, but he never found a magic that would have let him enjoy them.